This help video is based on the powertrain control system strategies of the Syvecs range of ECUs and how you can utilize these to making your Syvecs ECU protect your investment in your engine and also your complete powertrain solution. What we're going to do is look over the different ways that these trips can be set up and ways that you can actually set up a sensor array database for different limps and a way that sensor failure actually invokes different limp modes. The first thing we're going to look at the under calibration switches, the actual trip settings for the way that you can set up oil pressure trips, fuel pressure trips, engine coolant, engine oil temperature and crankcase pressure and many more. So what you need to do is go to calibration switches and go down to the engine trip section of the calibration switches tree. You'll see that then you've got the option to be able to set different crankcase pressure trips and engine coolant temperature pressure trips based on your calibration selection. So different maps that you have running on the current calibration, you can actually assign it so that, say, the oil pressure trip is off in one switch with oil temperature. But we do recommend that these are always set to yes if the allocated sensor, like the oil pressure sensor, is fitted. So what we're going to do, we're going to go down to the sensors area and explain how you set up these items. But it's important to mention that if you do want these enabled, you need to make sure that they are set to yes under this section. So if we go down to the sensors section, and first look at the first one on the top of the tree, which would be come down to the crankcase pressure. You've got crankcase pressure trip. What you've got here is you've got a trip enable runtime. So this is the amount of time that the engine needs to be in run mode before the trip becomes enabled. In this particular map, it's set as 10 seconds. You can then set defining trip pressures that you wish to use. So that if, for example, your crankcase pressure went over on this particular map, let's say 2 bar at different allocated throttle positions, you can actually invoke a trip. What you can do, that's worth mentioning, is you can set a number of trips allowed before the actual limp will be invoked. We do recommend this is at 0 if used in a high power system that you want the engine to be protected under no circumstances. If it's in a race scenario where you can actually feel that the trip occurs, that you can actually warn the driver about it via the dash so that he knows there is a problem there, to back off the power a little bit, to actually make it successfully back to the pitch. You can actually set a number of trips now before an actual final limp would be set. You can then set the trip action of what you want it to do. You can either make it stop the engine or enter a limp mode, and then you can set the amount of time that it needs to be active, the actual pressure being over the actual trip pressure for the actual trip to occur. You've also then got an ignore trip until lateral G is less than. This is useful so that, say, if you did have like a car which had an oil pressure trip set up, the last thing you would want to do is invoke a trip to stop the engine during mid-corner. This is far more dangerous because obviously if you suddenly kill the engine power mid-corner on a high G corner, you can actually put the car into a spin. So it's important this calibration is set up right for, say, different trips. All of the trip settings are the same for all of the items. So for your engine coolant temperature, you've got the engine trip. Same again for the engine oil pressure. All the items under the table are the same. The only thing that's different with the engine oil pressure is you have a dip time, so that it will allow you to set a certain amount of time where the oil pressure can dip for a specific amount, like 250 milliseconds, where the actual trip won't be active and kicked in, but you can set it so that if the dip is dropped below the actual trip pressure for more than the dip amount of times, then the trip will occur. Okay. So, and the engine oil pressure trip is based on RPM again, so you can set your pressure in which, if for example below 46 psi of oil pressure at 5000 RPM, the engine trip will occur, and on this car it will set it to stop the engine, which is quite important. So the same goes for obviously the oil temperature. You've got an engine trip for different temperatures that you can set to above 150 degrees, it will trip. And you also then got the warm-up limp, and these are only on the engine coolant temperature and engine oil pressure. These are particularly useful that you can come in here and say that when the oil temperature is below 50 degrees, that the actual engine is in a limp mode where the throttle and the RPM limiter is invoked, so the customer cannot go full power until the engine oil temperature is up to a satisfactory level where the calibrator is happy. You've got a warm-up time here for the amount of time that the actual the limp can be active for, so that for for say 3,000 seconds, the actual trip will be active, and if under 3,000 seconds, if the warm-up temp is not above 50 degrees, obviously it will still be in limp. So the other items that you've got, the fuel pressure, this one needs a bit more specific attention because you have the ability to set a trip on relative pressure, which we pretty much do and recommend in all of our kits. The relative pressure is the pressure that is relative between the actual fuel pressure and the manifold pressure, and this relative pressure on most instances should be absolutely flat if you have a one-to-one rising rate regulator installed. On most of our kits that we supply with, they do have a rising rate regulator, so the trip pressure is the one to use. What you can then do is you can say that in the instance of, say, you are on full power on boost, and for some unforeseen circumstance the fuel pressure starts to drop, your relative fuel pressure will start to drop, and you can then set a trip pressure that if it drops below X amount, which is shown here, the actual limp mode will be invoked, and at this point it will be set to a limp mode and not stop engine. A new feature which is in the latest 1.48 and above is the lean lambda trip, which is really useful on 12 injector installs. What this basically means is you can actually come in here and set so that if, for example, above 3,800 RPM and above 70% throttle and above 1 bar of boost, if the lambda goes leaner than 0.87 lambda for more than 600 milliseconds, we invoke a limp. Okay? And this basically puts the car into an early rev limiter and shuts the throttles down to stop the customer from damaging his engine. Okay, it's particularly useful on the 12 injectors because obviously there are two sets of injectors driving a cylinder, and if one was to fail, you need to make sure that you have that situation dealt with as quickly as possible before any damage is incurred to the engine. So, one question we get asked also a lot by a lot of our customers is how they can set up their own custom trips for different sensors which they've got fitted. What we're going to do is explain this. What we'll use is we'll use, say, for example, the air charge temperature, for example. So if you would like to set a trip that basically says that when your air charge temperature is, say, for example, above, say, 100 degrees, that you want to actually put it into a limp mode, the way we need to go about this is first go into the engine charge temperature and look at your linearization table. So what you want to do is once you know this calibration is set up correctly, what you want to do is see where the point of 100 degrees is. So you can see here 100 degrees and 0.235 volts, okay, this is the point where you'd like to invoke like a trip. So what we'd suggest doing here is basically taking this voltage and actually putting this into the default voltage low. When you change this, say to 0.235, you'll then see that the red line under the linearization then follows the point of where the 100 degrees is. At this point, if the voltage on that sensor then drops below this value here, which would be like around the 100 degrees mark, it will actually bring up a sensor warning which will be displayed under device, and it'll be under errors. This is not shown at the moment. It will be a red item which is shown under here when you are online. What we recommend doing is if you have got something like this set up, or any sensors you have fitted to the ECU and calibrated, you need to set up the actual sensor to be part of the error item bit assignment map down here. What this means is you can come in here and set for different items of a level of sensor error what actually happens. So you can say for the first 15 places in that error bit assignment table that it's for a minor sensor failure. So if any of these sensors fail, which you've got set in here, you can do so. If you want to add a new one, and say set one based on brake pressure, you can add that into there, go to your brake pressure, set up the default low based on the linearization value you want it to be tripped at, as we explained in the air charge temp, and what that will do is it will actually throw up a sensor warning level, okay, as a limp mode, and you can set here that limp mode occurs if any sensor warning level exceeds the OK mark. So any item that is set in this table here that goes basically for the sensor to fail and shows up a device error is less than or higher than the default low or high voltages, basically it incurs a limp mode straight away. Now this is a real good way of being able to set safety trips for yourself and custom ones. So it's particularly useful to memorize this when you are setting up a car, and also to make sure that if you do have any sensors fitted on a kit which are actually not present in the this table, it is important to make sure they are assigned. So if there is ever a failure to that sensor, that basically the engine check light would come on with any of our kits, and also a limp mode is incurred. Okay, well, we hope this has been useful, and hopes to protecting your investment in the engine more. And further questions on this should be asked to support@syvecs.co.uk. Thank you very much.